A single rifle, drawn in a Soviet hospital by a 21-year-old tank mechanic wounded at Bryansk, became the most duplicated weapon in history. It outlasted empires and outgunned its rivals everywhere, from Vietnam's jungles to failed states on every continent. How did Mikhail Kalashnikov's quest for simplicity unleash a tool of conflict that now fills both battlefields and national flags? The answer begins in 1941, in a moment of quiet desperation. It ends with consequences no one could control. October 1941. The forests around Bryansk echoed with gunfire as German troops pressed toward Moscow, and a 21-year-old Soviet tank mechanic named Mikhail Kalashnikov found himself in the heart of the chaos. Shrapnel tore through his left shoulder during a desperate counterattack, ending his combat role and sending him to a crowded field hospital in Trubchevsk. The wound ran deep, but the sense of helplessness cut deeper. Kalashnikov later described lying awake at night, listening to wounded soldiers curse the weapons that failed them, guns that jammed in the mud, rifles too fragile for the front. His hands, once stained with oil and tank grease, now shook from fever and frustration. But the mind that had kept T-34 engines running in battle refused to idle. On a battered wooden table beside his hospital bed, Kalashnikov began to sketch. He was no trained engineer. His only schooling came from village workshops and the Red Army's machine shops. But he understood the difference between tools that worked and those that broke when lives depended on them. He drew a rifle that was simple, rugged, and could be built quickly by unskilled hands. Years later, he would recall those pencil lines as the first step toward what he called a soldier's rifle, a weapon designed not for engineers, but for men fighting and dying in the mud. When Kalashnikov left the hospital, his sketch traveled with him. He sent it to the design bureau of small arms in Izhevsk, the industrial city that would become the birthplace of the AK-47. The journey from a wounded mechanic's bedside to the drawing boards of Soviet engineers had begun, driven by the urgent need for a weapon that could survive the war as surely as its users hoped to. The rifle that took shape in Izhevsk was more than the sum of its parts. At its core, the design team settled on a long-stroke gas piston system, a mechanism that harnessed the force of burning gunpowder to drive a solid piston the full length of the bolt's travel. This single decision meant the action would cycle with relentless momentum, brushing aside sand, mud, or ice that might stop a more delicate weapon. Unlike Western rifles built to tight tolerances, the AK's moving parts floated in a sea of space, with clearances up to 0.5 millimeter wide. Debris that would jam a precision-made bolt simply rattled around inside the AK and fell away. Early on, the team faced pressure to simplify further. The original AK-47 used a milled receiver carved from a solid block of steel, a slow and costly process. In 1959, Soviet engineers unveiled the AKM, a stamped sheet metal version that slashed production time from 40 hours to just 12. The stamped receiver, pressed and welded from thin steel, could be manufactured on basic machinery by workers with minimal training. The weight dropped by over 1 kilogram, but the rifle's core remained unchanged. The same piston, the same generous tolerances, the same rugged reliability. Every feature served a purpose. The selector lever was oversized for use with gloved hands. The curved magazine fed rounds smoothly, even when bent or dented. The rifle could be stripped for cleaning in minutes, without tools. These choices made the AK not just a weapon, but a blueprint for mass production, one that could be copied, adapted, and churned out by factories across the globe. With the design complete and the manufacturing process refined, the stage was set for the rifle's true proliferation. not just as a Soviet weapon, but as an exportable engine of conflict. By the mid-1950s, the Soviet Union had turned the AK-47 into a tool of statecraft. Arms shipments were no longer just military transactions, they became levers of power tightly controlled by Moscow's export bureaus. Between 1954 and 1959, declassified records show that 2.8 million rifles were transferred to Allied states, most as grant-type aid rather than direct sales. These shipments bundled rifles, ammunition, and training into one package, binding recipient armies and governments to Soviet interests. The rifle's first true test outside Soviet borders came on the streets of Budapest in November 1956. As Soviet troops moved in to crush the Hungarian Revolution, the AK-47 appeared in public view for the first time. Western intelligence reports and eyewitness accounts describe how Hungarian students and factory workers, many with little or no military training, seized AK-47s from abandoned trucks or captured them in firefights. Within hours, these insurgents, some barely out of school, were rearming themselves with the same rifles intended to suppress them. The weapon's simple controls and forgiving mechanics meant that even a novice could field strip, reload, and fire effectively under fire. For many in the West, the sight of rebels turning Soviet arms against Soviet tanks was a revelation. The AK-47's reputation for reliability and its uncanny ability to slip from state control into insurgent hands began to take on a life of its own, crossing the Iron Curtain as both a weapon and a symbol. Mud clung to boots and rifles alike on the trails outside Da Nang, but not every weapon struggled. In the thick of the Vietnam War, American infantrymen began to notice a troubling pattern. Their newly issued M16 rifles, touted as cutting edge, were locking up in the heat, rain, and red clay. Meanwhile, captured AK-47s, pried from fallen Viet Cong or found in bamboo caches, kept firing, no matter how soaked or filthy they became. One Marine recalled swapping his M16 for an AK after a day-long monsoon, and later said it never stuck, even after crawling through rice paddies. Field reports tell of entire squads quietly replacing their standard rifles with enemy guns, trusting the AK's rough mechanics over the M16's promises, and in doing so exposing the AK's reliability. By 1971, the Senate Armed Services Committee convened hearings in Washington, where returning soldiers described moments when a jammed rifle meant the difference between life and death. The committee demanded answers, pressing military brass on why American troops were forced to rely on enemy weapons for survival. That year, the Pentagon ordered a redesign of the M16, adding chrome-lined chambers and new training programs, but the damage to confidence lingered. In the mud and chaos of Vietnam, the AK-47's reputation was sealed not by propaganda, but by the testimony of those who had staked their lives on what worked. Crates packed with AK-47 rifles moved quietly across borders, their origins masked by secret deals and falsified paperwork. During the 1980s, the CIA Operation Cyclone became a hidden artery for Soviet rifles, channeling nearly 200,000 AK-47 rifles through Pakistan to Afghan fighters battling Soviet troops. Intelligence files tracked serial numbers from Soviet batches, yet as the war dragged on, records blurred. Forensic teams later found the same serial ranges in Taliban stockpiles, decades after the original shipments. Meanwhile, in Iraq, U.S. auditors faced a different kind of mystery. By 2007, the Government Accountability Office reported that about 110,000 AK-47 rifles supplied for Iraqi police and army units were missing from official inventories. Chain of custody logs were incomplete, and convoys sometimes vanished entirely. Congressional testimony described how rifles meant for allies slipped into the hands of insurgents. The question hung in the air. Once these weapons crossed the line from state control, where did they really end up? When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, its armories burst open. Warehouses across Russia, Ukraine, and the former Eastern Bloc held millions of AK-47s and AKMs, once guarded by state security, now left in limbo. Arms brokers, some former military officers and others opportunists with the right connections, moved quickly to tap this surplus. According to United Nations estimates, roughly 3 million surplus rifles slipped into illicit circulation during the 1990s. The numbers alone dwarf most official armies. Investigative reports tracked shipments from abandoned depots in the Urals to ports in West Africa, where rifles traded hands for as little as $30 to $50 each. In Sierra Leone, one documented deal saw 13,000 AKs swapped for cattle, then handed out to fighters as young as 12. The rifle's low price and sheer availability turned it from a weapon of war into a commodity, easier to buy in some regions than a sack of grain, and far more enduring. The AK-47's next chapter would not be written by generals or politicians. It would be written by anyone with cash, livestock, or a favor to trade. A rifle once drawn by a wounded mechanic in a field hospital now appears on the national flag of Mozambique, its silhouette crossed with a hoe and crowned by a star. Adopted in 1983, the flag's message is unambiguous. The AK-47 stands as much for revolution as for survival. Elsewhere, the rifle's outline rises in the emblem of Hezbollah, clenched in a raised fist, a symbol of resistance broadcast to millions. Across battlefields from West Africa to the Middle East, the AK-47 has become more than a weapon. UNICEF and Human Rights Watch estimate that over 70% of child soldiers worldwide are armed with this rifle, their small hands gripping cold metal meant for war. In 2013, Mikhail Kalashnikov, then in his 90s, wrote a private letter released by Rostec, confessing to a burden he could not shake. He asked if he bore responsibility for the deaths caused by his invention, admitting his intent had been to defend, not to destroy. The question lingers, heavy and unresolved, in every place the rifle endures. Today, over 100 million AK pattern rifles circulate worldwide, more than any other firearm. Each conflict zone that echoes with their fire is a reminder. Small inventions can outlive their makers, shaping destinies they never imagined. History's simplest weapon still decides who holds power and who pays the price.